everyone, today we'll be looking at the poem Ozymandias, and this video is going to focus on the outside bits, so the form, structure, themes and socio-historic context. Now this is really important if you want to get a grade 9, because looking at the motives of why the writer, who is Shelley, decided to write Ozymandias is very, very important. Socio-historic context is incredibly important in getting to know the whole of the poem. So yes, the language features are important, but the reason behind the poem is equally as important, especially if you want to get a grade 9. So let's look at the themes of Ozymandias. So we've got time and transience. Transience basically means the passing of time. And if you read Ozymandias through, you can see that there's a heavy focus on the way that time passes by and what that means for Ozymandias himself. There's also power, pride and ego, which I think is pretty simple. Like, there's a lot of power and pride and ego that Ozymandias himself is exhibiting, and actually it's quite an ironic poem, because as we'll look into it a bit more, we'll see that his power, his pride, his high ego really gets him nowhere in the end of the poem. It doesn't last, and that's a very important part of the theme, which we can match with the idea of human frailty. So actually I would say that these two themes are quite contrasting. They contrast with each other, as Ozymandias seems to have a very high idea of himself. He has a lot of ego, but actually he is a human, and he doesn't outlast nature very long. Nature actually ends up destroying him at the end. In fact, that is one theme which should have been on there, but nature is a very important theme, because ultimately, if you have read the poem and you have gone over it with your teachers, you'll know that nature actually outlasts Ozymandias himself, and ends up destroying a lot of his monuments, leaving it bare. And that adds on very well with destruction. Obviously, many things are destroyed in the poem. But look at what exactly is destroyed, because I think it's quite obvious that Ozymandias himself is destroyed. All his monuments are destroyed. That is terrible. All his monuments are destroyed, but actually, could we say that his ego is also destroyed? Could we say that nature has destroyed a lot of things? Or could we say that Ozymandias has destroyed himself? What else is destroyed? Is it his artwork? Have a look at this theme. Actually, it's a really interesting one. We might go into it in more detail later on. Old versus new. Again, what has lasted? What is old and what is new? And how do old and new clash and collide with each other in the poem? We're going to look at some basic socio-historic context. So first thing to note, which you might or might not know, is that Ozymandias was also known as Ramses II. His name was Ozymandias, and that was Greek. That's his Greek name. And Ramses II was his Egyptian name. Now, he was an Egyptian pharaoh or emperor, and he did rule ancient Egypt. He ruled for absolutely ages, like I'm talking as long as Queen Victoria, a very long time, which was just such a long time, especially in ancient Egypt when they died so quickly. And he was also incredibly powerful, and he had time to make all these monuments and be remembered. So this was actually a fact. He did leave behind many, many monuments, many, many pieces of art. So think back to that theme that we were talking about just before, art and culture. That was just incredibly important if you wanted to make an impact as an emperor or a pharaoh. Leaving behind a huge amount of art and culture meant that you were long-lasting and powerful. That is an actual fact. I also noted that the poem is called Ozymandias and not Ramses II. You might have noted this too. And there could be several reasons for this, some more complicated than others. So I'm going to start off with the least complicated, and that is that Shelley studied ancient Greek. He actually knew a lot of ancient Greek, and so it may have just been because he wanted to call his poem Ozymandias. He preferred the Greek name. Another reason could be that back in the 1818s, so the kind of late teens in 1800 times, just before the Victorian era, around kind of the Romantic era, a lot more people just simply knew about the ancient Greeks. I'm really sorry for my messy writing, by the way. But more people knew about the ancient Greeks. More knowledge about the Egyptians came a lot later. So Ozymandias, the Greek name, was just probably more recognisable to a lot of the readers of Shelley's time, and so he decided to call it Ozymandias. Another reason why Shelley might have decided to call his poem Ozymandias is quite a big reason, because the name split up is quite ironic. So Ozy, the first bit of Ozymandias, means to breathe. And mandius comes from the Greek word mandate. That is an A, by the way. And that means to rule. Ozy, by the way, comes from the Greek word Ozy. So the name itself actually signifies Ozymandias' personality. He breathes to rule. Does he get it? Does he actually successfully rule? You can decide that for yourself. To talk a little bit more about a little bit of a complicated topic, which is why Shelley chose to call the poem Ozymandias. Now, the reasons before were definitely important. Ancient Greek was more well known, and Ozymandias is the ancient Greek name for Ramses II. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper and make a more sophisticated point. Personally, I think that the reason that Shelley decided to call the poem Ozymandias was to make the reader think about Ozymandias' other name, Ramses II. So, essentially, what I'm saying is Shelley called the poem Ozymandias deliberately, so that the reader, who would have been educated, who, even though they weren't well known, well versed in ancient Egypt, still would have known that Ozymandias was known as Ramses II. They would have known that much at least. They would have known that Ozymandias had a second name. The importance of this goes back to the Bible, and it's known as the story of the Tower of Babel. Essentially, this story, long story short, is that a bunch of people decided to make a tower which reached heaven so that they could all make a name for themselves. These people wanted to make a name for themselves by creating a tower that went to heaven. This didn't really work out. God found out and decided to destroy the tower, scatter everyone, and create different languages. So it was from the Tower of Babel that different languages were created. You can actually look up this story yourself and actually read up on it in more detail. But essentially, the story is the story of how a bunch of arrogant people wanted to get a tower that reached heaven and create a name for themselves and get a lot of reputation and fame. And God found out, got angry, scattered everyone everywhere, and created different languages. The importance of the story is that these people thought that name meant identity. And God, in order to punish these people, created different names for the same thing. I mean, what is language? Language, and different languages, especially different languages, means different names for the same thing. So according to the Tower of Babel, one name for something meant power, it meant identity, it meant reputation. I mean, most importantly, it meant power. Many names for one thing meant less power. Now remember, in Shelley's time, 1817 to 18, which was when this poem was written, people knew this. Everyone would have known about this story, the Tower of Babel. Everyone would have known that the Bible itself talks about names and the importance of having one name for one thing. It meant power, it meant identity, it meant reputation. God himself only has one name. So the fact that Ozymandias has more than one name, well, I'm pretty sure that Shelley made sure to call Ozymandias Ozymandias for a reason. And it was to remind the reader that Ozymandias has more than one name. Hence, he has less power. Especially according to the oldest book in his time, the Bible. A name was rendered less important if there was more than one. A person was rendered less important and less powerful if they had more than one name. Let me also remind you that during this time, 1818, there was a lot of class hierarchy, and names were super important, guys. For example, if you're a duke, that's very important. Your name is a duke. Your station in life is according to your name. If you had a certain second name that was important, for example, I can't think of an example, but a duke would have been very important, and hierarchy and names and familial names especially. So the name of your family and what you inherited was very important as well. So just before the Victorian times, this was the Romantic era. Pre-Victorian names were important. So yeah, sorry, it's a very complicated topic, one that you can absolutely disregard if you want, but one that will be very, very, very good for your essay. We're going to look at some contextual factors which make Percy Shelley the writer he is, and could link into why Shelley decided to write Ozymandias in the way that he did. So first things first, it's important to note that Shelley was a romantic poet, and by this I mean that he wrote about not romantic things, but romanticism meant the power of nature. There was a huge focus on the power of nature, and in particular the sublime power that nature had. And by sublime, what I mean is the strength that nature had. So romantic poets usually focus quite heavily on nature as a source of strength, as a source of power, as a source of great extremities. Nature had a huge role to play in romantic poetry, and romantic poets would focus a lot on the way that nature overpowered mankind. So this links very well with Ozymandias, because in Ozymandias this theme is so huge that nature outlives man. No one can live up to nature. No one has the power that nature has. So that is definitely a very good point that you could bring up. Another interesting point is that Shelley was heavily involved in believing in equality. His father was actually anti-slavery, and so was he. He obviously believed in feminism. His wife was Mary Shelley, whose mother was a feminist icon. So, you know, he was quite the feminist, and he was quite the equalitist, if that's a word. And he also dabbled a lot in science and the way that science worked, and Gothicism. which is basically a focus on supernatural. Again, like I said, his wife was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and that is one of the great Gothic novels. So yeah, this focus on kind of different things, more radical things, more kind of unique approaches to life. The idea that life isn't what it seems, that there are things that could be underneath the surface. Shelley was very interested in this, and so was his wife, and actually so was his father. And another thing, I think, going on from that, that is an interesting point about Shelley, is that he was an atheist, which means he didn't believe in God. And he actually wrote a paper called The Necessity of Atheism, which you can actually check out if you're really interested. And he wrote that under a pseudonym, because back then, to not believe in God was just a power move. It was crazy, and you could get killed for that. It was a very revolutionary and radical approach. So yeah, he was a radical. I think that's very important to note. And then the last point, which I'm going to leave you with, is that Shelley was anti-monarchy. I think it's safe to say that Shelley opposed the monarchy, opposed this idea of kings and queens having all the power. This links very well with his kind of belief in equality. He believed that there shouldn't be kind of one dictatorship or one family which had all the power. He believed that power should be more dispersed. Now, this is a very, very strong point. Now, Shelley's dad, and let me just messily put that up there. Shelley's dad was what was known as a Whig, and this was a political party which was anti-monarchist. Whigs believed that monarchy was a form of kind of totalitarianism, and they weren't on it. They were anti-monarchy. And so Shelley took these ideas on in a lot of his poetry and in a lot of his works. And Ozymandias really reflects this kind of anti-monarchy as well. Ozymandias, who is a kind of totalitarian ruler, he was kind of a dictator in a way, ends up failing to leave behind anything. He essentially doesn't succeed in what he wants. And I think Ozymandias is quite a radical poem because it reflects Shelley's own views of anti-monarchy and the belief that things should be equal. There shouldn't be one dictator. Equality should be dispersed. And we'll talk about this more when we discuss language. But I think some of the main points that we can really focus on, that I have touched on here, about Shelley and his beliefs, that we can link to Ozymandias, is power of nature. Definitely. I mean, the sublime power of nature and the strength that it has over anything, that's a huge point. I would also add the anti-monarchy is a huge contextual point. And also, perhaps you could link this to Shelley's own atheist views. Now, I say this because I think you could definitely suggest that Shelley's atheist views show up in Ozymandias through his kind of God complex. So Ozymandias definitely has a God complex. He believes that he is God. And there's also a lot of biblical language in Ozymandias, which Shelley kind of mocks almost. Again, like I said, we'll talk about language features and what exactly is biblical in the poem later on, but there definitely is a lot of biblical language which Shelley mocks. And Ozymandias is a god in a way. He views himself as a god and wants to be viewed as godlike, and he's completely kind of destroyed by the end of the poem. All his artwork, everything that he leaves behind is ruined because nothing, not even God, can stand up to the power of nature and its strength. So some of Shelley's political views. Number one, and I've pointed this out before, but Shelley believed in equality, and in a little bit more detail, what he really believed in was reform. So he believed in something called socialism. I forgot how to spell socialism there, by the way. Which basically means that everyone is equal, right? bit of a redundant point, and I've repeated myself a couple of times, but yes, that's what Shelley believed in, and he took great kind of passion in what he believed in. He believed that poverty should be ended and that one group of people shouldn't have all the power. And of course, this was written in a time where there was extreme inequality. You know, rich were very rich and the poor were very poor. This still stands today, but obviously back then it was so strong, and there was such kind of emphasis on class, and kind of the ruling class, and the kind of dukes and duchesses and viscounts and barons and whatnot. So Shelley didn't really believe in all that. He thought it was rubbish. And leading on to that point, I think this links very well with Ozymandias, because of course you have Ozymandias as a ruler, and what happens to him at the end? Well, he doesn't last. Everything that he mentions, all his monuments, all his riches, all his gold, is ultimately futile. It disappears in the force of nature. Another point, which could be quite important, is that Shelley wrote this poem at a time where when Napoleon was falling. So a lot of people believe that this poem was about Napoleon Bonaparte, or Bonaparte, however you want to pronounce his name. It doesn't matter because you're writing it. But Napoleon, actually, in 1798, so just a few years before this poem was written, and a lot of people would have remembered this moment, and Shelley in particular, a keen politician, would have remembered this. But in 1798, Napoleon actually invaded Egypt and attempted to rule parts of Egypt, especially the areas surrounding the Nile, and he failed. The British actually got this part of Egypt. So Napoleon, obviously a great enemy of the British, he was actually fighting the British around this time as well, and there were obviously the Napoleonic Wars which happened, which you can do your own research on. But the important thing is that a lot of people thought that this bit, the fact that Napoleon attempted to invade Egypt, was a direct hit and a direct kind of influence on Ozymandias the poem, which of course is focused on the Egyptian pharaoh. People believe that Ozymandias was influenced by Napoleon, and of course, like I said, around this time when the poem was written and published, obviously Napoleon had failed and was hiding in exile. So he was a failed ruler. A lot of people would have known this and probably equated it to Ozymandias himself, who was kind of posited as a failed ruler. Another thing about Ozymandias which could reflect Shelley's views, a lot of people did believe that Ozymandias also represented King George, who was the monarch of the time. So around this time, 1817, 1818, King George was the ruling monarch. And as we mentioned in the video before, Shelley was very anti-monarchy, or rather, he was anti-class and class dictatorship, and anti one group of people having all the money and all the power. And the monarchy really at this time represented a ruling class. They were the top ruling class in Britain. It was very different to what we have now, which is where the monarchy kind of represent something a bit different. At this time, the monarchy were like right in your face, and they also made a lot of they had a heavy influence in politics as well, the monarchy, and King George would have had a heavy influence on politics. So there was less kind of power given to politicians and more power given to dukes and duchesses, absolutely not duchesses, dukes and viscounts and the aristocracy. So power was given to monarchy and aristocracy. So again, the monarchy were the top of the top. They were the highest ruling class. So Ozymandias could very well represent King George, who represents monarchy and a ruling class and kind of dictatorship or totalitarianism, which Shelley hated. right? This is messy and I'm sorry. Please pause whenever you feel like you need to pause. Okay, and the last thing, I'm not going to eat your head too much. So the last thing I'm going to point out is that one more thing which could reflect Shelley's reasons for writing Ozymandias is that the poem could be a reflection of Shelley's views on romantic poetry. Now, we have talked a little bit about the fact that Shelley was a romantic poetry, his belief in the sublime power of nature. And the poem itself could be a reflection of romantic poetry and how romantic poetry and art and nature and everything around that will always outlive mankind. And the poem itself is a reflection of art, isn't it? So the poem itself is a piece of art, kind of a complex topic. So let me just add a new board. You can go back and pause whatever you need to jot down, but poetry is a form of art, isn't it? I think we can all agree. Poetry is a form of art. And Ozymandias, the poem, you could say that the poem outlives Ozymandias himself. So, the poem could be a direct representation on how art outlives man. So, again, just a representation that art or poetry or sculptures will always win over people. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the form of the poem. And for those who don't know, form means the type of poem. Essentially, form is format. So the format of the poem is a sonnet, and all sonnets have 14 lines with no breaks in between. There's no stanzas, it's just one long chunk of poetry, and that means it's a sonnet. It has 14 lines, you can count. So a sonnet is a love poem, which is why I've drawn a little heart, and it always has 14 lines. And there are two forms of sonnets, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, but I'm just going to talk about them here as well. There are two popular forms of sonnets, and that is one, the Shakespearean sonnet, and two, the Italian or Petrarchan sonnets. Both these sonnets tend to have a regular rhyme scheme, and I'm going to tell you now, even though I have written out the rhyme scheme on the next slide, I'm going to tell you now that the rhyme scheme for this sonnet, Ozymandias, is very, very unconventional. So let's have a look at the rhyme scheme. An English sonnet typically has A, B, which seems pretty normal and consistent with an English sonnet. The first bit of this is a lot like an English sonnet. And then an English sonnet has C, D. And obviously this is when it starts to become more of a hybrid form. E, F, and then G. Notice how an English sonnet finishes with two rhyming couplets. Usually those two rhyming couplets, if you're interested, at the end of an English sonnet are used to represent a loving pair. As I said 50 million times, a sonnet is a love poem, so the rhyme of the sonnet usually reflects that by having, especially in an English sonnet or a Shakespearean sonnet, it has GG at the end to really kind of cement the fact that it's talking about a pair or two people in love. However, in this sonnet, we don't have any kind of pairs. We pretty much have a lot of interruption, you could say, or a lot of kind of inconsistencies, and definitely not much of a stable rhyme scheme. There's no pairs to be seen and no kind of stability in the rhyme to be seen. It's everywhere, really, even though it begins quite stable. I guess you could say this is a lot like an English sonnet. It begins a lot like an English sonnet. It definitely doesn't end like one. And there could be a lot of reasons for this. So let's start off by looking at why Shelley has decided to write his poem as a sonnet. So, one of the main reasons why Shelley might decide to write the poem as a sonnet, which is, remember, a love poem, could be because he is mocking the subject of the poem. Remember, the subject is Ozymandias, no one else. By encapsulating the poem within a love poem, but there's no love in the poem itself, it's just about Ozymandias and his ego, we can say that Shelley is clearly creating contrast between Ozymandias' personality and the form. So there's a great contrast between who Ozymandias is, full of ego, full of self-love, and the very idea of a sonnet, which is about two people in love with each other. Ozymandias isn't in love with anyone but himself. He is, as we mentioned before, full of ego, and ego is basically the love of self, having a high idea of oneself. So there we go. It's pretty simple, and this is probably one of the strongest points you can be making. Here, you'll be looking at form, which is a completely sophisticated thing to do. Form equals sonnet. Understanding form, that it's a love poem. Every single sonnet suggests that love will be involved, and then taking out the love factor. There's no love in the poem. Or at least there is, but Ozymandias just loves himself. So I guess you could say there's either the opposite of love or self-love. However you want to write out. The point is that Shelley deliberately does this. It gets the reader of the poem thinking about the form of the sonnet and how this contrasts with the subject matter. More reason why Shelley has decided to write the poem as a sonnet. Reason number 2, and I've got the poem up here just to remind you guys about the topic of the poem. It just helps to bring it up occasionally. But another reason could be that the non-traditional rhyme scheme makes the poem more unique, makes it individual. It separates the poem from tradition. Now let's look at the actual poem and see why this is important. So we've got a semantic field of also known as a lexical field of individuality or supremacy, and these two words basically mean that Ozymandias is egotistical and thinks that he is the best of the best. So let's have a look at some words. Lexical field, semantic field, basically words which all match up to this idea that Ozymandias is pretty full of himself, and see how we can link this to why the rhyme scheme is how it is within the form of a sonnet. So here we go, let's have a look. Sneer of cold command, to yet survive, hand that mocked and the heart that fed, King of kings, look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair, nothing besides remains. So we've got words such as King of kings, survive, sneer, also command. All these words kind of really emphasize Ozymandias' high self-esteem. I know that seems kind of silly to be saying that Ozymandias has self-esteem, but he does. He's full of himself. He's so up himself. So up himself that he seems mean, sneering and commanding, and presenting himself as mighty. You know? So how does this link to the fact that this sonnet is a sonnet, a love poem, but non-traditional? Well, the sonnet is different. Like we said, it's unique, it's individual, just as Ozymandias views himself as unique, individual. And like we stressed before, there is a subject who loves something. Ozymandias loves himself. He thinks the highest of himself